Good afternoon, students and parents. My name is Jacob Damery. In today's session, we will delve into a thought-provoking subject that affects our society deeply: how American media amplifies violence and stigmatizes mental illness through their coverage of school shooting aftermaths. In this educational script, we aim to shed light on the subtle yet impactful ways media influences our perceptions and contributes to the ongoing challenges faced by those affected. Let's start by acknowledging the fact that the media plays a vital role in keeping us informed about major events, such as school shootings. However, when it comes to reporting on these tragic incidents, it is evident the reckless behavior media pursue. Looking at an article posted titled "Analysis of 48 Hours of Television News Coverage Following the Columbine School Shooting," it was highlighted that media often spotlight the perpetrators while also fueling false narratives. Furthermore, an additional article sheds light on the possibility for this focus of coverage to contribute to copycat behavior. It's crucial to analyze the extent to which the media amplifies the violence and perpetuates stereotypes surrounding mental illness. Furthermore, it was found that many articles that highlighted people with mental illness more likely to be violent. Although in an article titled "Is there a link between mental illness and mass shootings?" it was concluded that only 5% of mass shootings were the result of severe mental illness. And an additional article provided a study stating that 96 of violent crimes were not the result of mentally ill individuals. To better understand this phenomenon, we have the pleasure and opportunity to speak with Shachi Krul. As the executive director of the Angus Reid Institute, Krul has a remarkable grasp on what we've collectively thinking about society's most pressing issues. One of North America's premier non-partisan, non-profit research and public polling organizations, the Institute helps debunk harmful myths and expand public knowledge in a meaningful way. Krul, having spent the first half of her career as a political reporter, brings nearly 2 decades of public policy expertise to her role, and has even been sought by policymakers to testify before the House of Commons. Today, she is regularly called upon by the media for her unique insight, including on CBC's At Issue, Canada's most watched political panel. Welcome to the show, Shachi. It's an absolute pleasure to have you with us today.
Thanks, Jacob. It's my pleasure to be with you.
Let's hop into some questions. What is your take on how the media handles school shootings?
It's a good question, but it's a really broad one. So I think the first thing to think about and remember is when we talk about news organizations and the media, and if you can picture me, I'm using air quotes. Um,
Hmm.
the question is really which media, because as we know, the way Fox News in the United States covers a school shooting versus the way CNN might cover it versus the way NBC, ABC, CBS might cover it, or the way MSNBC might cover it, are going to be vastly different. And that also goes for the way it's covered in Canada, where we not only consume a lot of American media directly, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, but also where news from the United States often dominates the news cycle and the agenda because they are our most close proximate neighbor, and what happens in that country is of interest to Canadians. So, if it's Fox, it's a lot of focus on thoughts and prayers and mental health and who was the shooter and what was wrong in their lives, and it's very much a lens on how police are handling it. If it's MSNBC or CNN, it's much more likely to be somebody like David Hogue being brought on as a guest. Hogue, of course, a survivor of the Parkland school shootings, or other gun control advocates who will say, here we go again. This has happened all over again. And it's very interesting and sad in a way, Jacob, that we're taping on the anniversary of the Sandy Hook school shooting that killed, dozens of like little kids at an elementary school, like
Hmm.
5-year-olds. And yet in so many ways, the script, whether it's a legacy media organization, a left of center news organization, or a right of center news organization. The script is so baked in because tragically, this keeps happening over and over again. So the first thing we have to say is, we can't make a global statement about how, quote unquote, the media handles it, because each media handles it differently. And one thing I would highlight is an in-depth piece that was in the Washington Post just a couple of weeks ago that looked at the Uvalde school shootings, and for the first time actually included images that contained blood. Usually,
Hmm.
media will, out of respect to the victims, and also just in order not to sensationalize and not to turn off their consumers, whether they're readers or viewers or listeners, they will try to sanitize quite a bit of what is exposed or shown. And it was interesting because they showed um, photos and images and snips of video that, in my mind, were still quite sanitized, but showed, dead bodies on the ground.
Hmm.
You don't tend to see that. And that was out of the Las Vegas mass shooting. Or Uvalde, where they showed these were photos that were taken by law enforcement in the classrooms after the fact that showed smears of blood and blood trails. And this was seen to be very brave and very groundbreaking because I think it pushed, well, and as the Washington Post said themselves, it pushed the line further in being more graphic, not to sensationalize, but perhaps to shock people out of what may be a little bit of complacency, because they don't necessarily always realize what a bullet does to a 5-year-old's body.
Hmm. Would you say that the media's lack of sensitivity contributes to a copycat behavior?
No, I would say almost the other one, entirely the opposite, the other way. The journalistic broadcasting standards and practices that are set out by various newsrooms, whether they're in Canada or in the United States, for the right reasons, set out to not sensationalize the graphicness of the images, right? You could see some really horrible images that are captured by camera people or by law enforcement, and then those images are then entered into a legal record and they are obtainable by media, but we don't show those things. They don't. I speak as a former broadcaster, but they don't show those things because, again, there is a desire not to sensationalize, and there is a desire not to really just sort of turn people off so badly or traumatize them so badly by looking at these extremely graphic images that they don't want to consume the news and understand what happened. Now, there's a big difference between newsrooms and news organizations that abide by certain standards and codes of conduct, and social media, where anything and everything goes.
Hmm. Yeah, no, as you mentioned, as a journalist yourself, have you ever had a time where you've had to balance producing a newsworthy story while showing extra sensitivity on the topic at hand?
Sure. I mean, we don't have acts of extreme violence happening in real time in Canada and in British Columbia in the same way that they have in the States or in other parts of the world, but I have covered my share of murders and plane crashes and other tragedies. In situations like that, the default was always, it's either a morning news program or a supper hour news program, and kids are watching. So these are not situations, in in the old days,
The old
families would
days.
would
Yes.
gather around a television set or one of multiple television sets in the home in the morning or after school, or what they call supper hour, which is 5 or 6 o'clock. I don't
Mhm.
know who eats dinner at 5 or 6 o'clock anymore. And so there was a real understanding and knowledge that there may be minors consuming this news at the same time as their parents. So you always erred on the side of caution, and you never erred on the side of sensationalism. I think sometimes, particularly in the cycle of violence that we are in, I sometimes wonder if that has normalized or desensitized news consumers to how horrible these things are, because they hear about them all the time, but they never see how terrible it
Hmm.
is, like both physically and emotionally. But you always have to balance that against the backdrop of not traumatizing the subjects that you're interviewing, and obviously not traumatizing your viewers. I had to do a lot of really tough things. If there was a murder, my job was sometimes to go knock on the door of a grieving relative, and sometimes those grieving relatives wanted to talk about who their loved one was, and they wanted to memorialize and eulogize and almost like an obituary. Other times they would set their dogs on you and you would have to run off the property. Same thing with tragedies such as plane crashes or car crashes or other terrible things that happen. And so you have to walk a line as a journalist between being respectful, but also trying to tell the story as fulsomely as possible. And that's often a very difficult line to walk, not only for the the journalist, but also for the family that is being inundated with requests to talk. But and it takes a toll on the mental health of the reporters, and it takes a toll, obviously, on the mental health of those who are related to or were friends and family of the victims. But being a crime reporter or being a reporter that is covering a breaking news story that includes death and tragedy is at times a very difficult and traumatizing job
For
unto
sure.
itself.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, so in addition to your background as a journalist, have you spent the past decade at the helm of our country's best regarded public polling organization? With that lens, can you talk about the impact of school shootings and its subsequent coverage on our collective psyche?
That's a really, really, really broad question, and I think you can answer it in different ways. And so I don't want to try to answer the whole of that question, because you've almost asked me like, how wide is the ocean? How deep is the sea? But
Hmm.
I'll pick out a few things. I think in terms of Canadian public opinion, which is what I measure quite a bit in my work, when those types of things happen, uh, even if it's in the United States. And again, remember, because of our laws, Canadian gun ownership laws are far more restrictive than they are in the United States. It certainly galvanizes opinion and support for particularly handgun control and assault rifle control and that kind of thing. So Canadians see what happens every time an AR-15 is deployed in Texas or Florida or Arizona or Colorado or another place. And Canadians are, as I say, they're seized by that. They're also repulsed by that. And it's why, in part, we see so much support for bans of assault rifles in Canada. There is pretty, I would say, there's a significant level of broad spectrum consensus support around the idea of banning assault style weapons. 4 in 5 Canadians say in Canada you should not own an AR-15. There's also a higher level of support for the banning of owning handguns.
Hmm.
Some of that is driven by perceptions that handgun violence, particularly in Canadian cities related to gangs, is pretty bad. But it's also, I think, a big, and it's my opinion only. I'm drawing inferences, but I know that a significant segment of Canadians consume US news. And then concurrently, a significant number of Canadians say there's no need to have a handgun in this country. Now, where we see a line drawn is more around things like hunting, weapons and rifles, and long guns. In urban centers, people don't they have less understanding of what it is to live on the land. If you're in rural Canada, and you're driving down a lonely rural road in November or January, and you come face to face with a bear or a moose, you may feel that extra bit of protection knowing that you have a legally registered long gun. And so long gun ownership is a very different beast, in not to use a pun, than handgun or assault rifle ownership. And in terms of where Canadian public opinion is on those two things, the handguns and on assault rifles, there's not only consensus, it's like the majority view.
Would you say that the media, like as Canadians consume more American media, the likelihood of school shootings traveling to here if we don't stop this like as you mentioned prior, you talked about how recently they've been being showing more graphic content. Do you think that level of like news capture will stop the perpetuating cycle?
The perpetuating cycle, particularly as it pertains to the United States, is something, because of our laws, and I think because of our culture, Canadian culture, the Canadian mindset. Thank God, like so many other things have permeated across a pretty porous border when it comes to culture and news consumption and consumption of media, whether it's Netflix or Amazon or whatever it is, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, news or entertainment. Um, and I say thank God, we don't it's not that we don't have gun violence in Canada. We do. Absolutely we do. We just don't have people who open carry assault rifles because they are legally entitled to do so. And there is no appetite for that. So in terms of the way the media covers it, the source that I mentioned earlier, Jacob, was the Washington Post. It wasn't CBC or CTV or the Globe and Mail or Global
Mhm.
News. And again, even though they showed depictions that were more graphic, they were hardly as graphic as they could have been. So, in terms of glorifying this stuff, at least at this stage, we do not have a culture or a psyche in Canada, not yet, that um, prioritizes the right to bear arms and open fire on your fellow citizens in the way that the United States does. And that has a lot to do with the founding of both of our countries, and it has a lot to do with our constitutions. The United States was born out of revolution, so the right to bear arms is like this cornerstone thing that particularly Republican politicians keep leaning on and keep going back to because it was baked into the birth of modern America.
Mhm.
The birth of modern Canada was an administrative function that talked about peace, order, and good government, where people in Britain decided in the 1850s that they were going to find a legislative way for Canada to have more autonomy. It's a very, very different beginning and birth, and it does have a profound impact on not only culture in this country, but also in terms of the laws. And so you can ask the question, what comes first, the culture or the legislation? But I would say that we were just formed differently.
So would you suggest for media to be less sensitive about the topic and show more graphic depictions in order to stop glorifying the attack or situation at hand?
I don't feel like I'm equipped to answer that, but it's always a difficult and fine line. And I'll give you an example from my time as a reporter. There also used to be basically a convention that newsrooms and news organizations did not report on suicides,
Mhm.
especially the suicides of young people. And they did not want to glorify or report on them in such a way because psychiatric research had shown that if you do that, then more people will copycat or follow suit. I was confronted and faced in a situation where the parents themselves, after the death, the suicide of a young teenage girl in Victoria, British Columbia, she had killed herself. Her body had sadly washed up on shore. The parents wanted to talk about it and they wanted to tell their story so that other families could better understand and recognize what was going on with the young woman. And I faced a tremendous amount of risk and pushback in telling that story.
Mhm.
And to this day, I still think about, was that the right thing? Was it the wrong thing? It was absolutely done with the consent of the parents, and it was the desire of the parents to tell the story. But institutions such as the school district and others, fought me tooth and nail. So, um, I think often that we develop conventions about the way we report and why we report and how we report out of things that are best intentioned and make sense in the time. And then sometimes times change and paradigms shift. And I don't think it's unreasonable from time to time to ask, are we too timid in the reporting? And I don't say that from a sensationalistic perspective. Nobody wants to see, and I'm going to be very graphic here, but nobody wants to see a child's body blown to bits, because that is what happens when an automatic weapon is deployed into the body of a child. It's
Mhm.
really quite horrible. I don't think anyone needs to see that, but at the same time, I think it's reasonable to ask whether we have sensitized coverage enough to the point that people don't quite register what it means or what's happened. And I would only conclude by saying I'm very, very glad I'm not the person who has to make those decisions and make those calls.
Mhm. So do you think American media should shift away from covering school shooting media, like in total, and just as
Oh, I no, I don't know. I mean, my personal opinion is no, we have to continue to cover it. It's a thing that happened. I mean, that is the fundamental of news. Is that what you're asking? That like we just don't cover it anymore?
at least not blow it up to a certain point, where it's international news?
Well, I don't know that media necessarily blow it up, or the fact that children are being shot to death at a school is by nature um something that will pick up public interest and something that people want to know about. Certainly, there is a chicken and egg aspect of it. If it is not covered, will people care? And frankly, I think you see that around a lot of the conflict that's happening, armed conflict that's happening in the global south. Like, is anybody talking about what's happening in parts of Africa right now? Is anybody talking about what's happening in Ukraine right now? So, what gets covered does set the agenda. I don't deny that, but I would be cautious around making blanket statements of media, quote unquote, blowing it up, because if anything, the conflicts around how media cover violence in schools where minors attend has more to do with the root causes of that violence, i.e., the availability of guns versus mental health or disturbed people, than it does with the notion that it's being sensationalized. Again, you got to remember we're talking about the discussions around legacy media. versus social media, where there are absolutely no guardrails,
Hmm.
no breaks, and nobody, it feels, and maybe I'm using hyperbole, but nobody to actually say, no, we're not going to do that. If you want to look at the most horrible things in the world, you go to social media for that.
When I was doing my research on this topic, I found lots of scholarly articles talking about how media purposely sheds blame, and specifically more right-winged American media, onto mental health, as opposed to gun laws and gun control. What are your thoughts of that?
Well, that's where I circle back to what I said almost right off the top of our conversation, where I talked about how the left right divide politically in this country has a very influential lens on how these things are covered.
So you would say they would appeal to their respective audiences more and fuel a narrative behind their political ideologies.
If you're a Fox News viewer, you're all about the amendment that says the constitutional amendment that says you have a right to bear arms. So that is fundamental. The tragedy of it then is framed around tragedy, yes, but heroics of law enforcement, and then the quote unquote mental health aspects that would have led somebody to do something like this. Um, a left of center news organization would focus and spend a lot of time and have its experts and its panel members and its editorial and its news staff focusing quite a bit more on, here we go again, here's yet another shooting, what will it take for uh, more stringent restrictions around gun ownership, particularly around the kinds of guns that make it so easy to kill people?
Would you say the mass divide between these two political parties could create stigmatization between mental health and even violent youth?
Help me understand that question a little more.
Well, I feel that with the Republican side focusing on the mental health aspect, young individuals who consume media unregulated have the potential to interpret that as fact, or create almost a self stigma if they're struggling with mental health. And then on the violence aspect, mental by pushing the narrative that mentally ill individuals or school shooters are mentally ill individuals, does that incite that mentally ill individuals are violent?
Well, frankly, that's a better question for someone who is a trained um, expert in that field. So
Hmm.
I'm reticent to go into issues of mental health simply because I'm not a mental health or a youth mental health expert.
Hmm.
Um, but you know, by definition, one might say that anybody who commits a violent crime or takes a life has crossed a line not only in terms of the conventions of their own mental health, but also in terms of the conventions of society. So then, if you're somebody who's prepared to cross that line, the thing that may make the difference is not your mental health and whether you're getting treated for it, but what is the availability of the lethal weapon that is available that you could put in your hands. And so, for example, I've just come back from Great Britain, and getting access to a gun is a big thing in Britain. It's not easy to do. That's why we see a lot of knife violence and a lot of gang members and a lot of unstable people. If they want to kill, they will do that with a blade rather than a gun.
Hmm.
It still can be lethal and deadly. The chances of killing 16 or 18 or 50 people with a knife is lesser than it is with a gun, objectively.
Yep.
But um, I think that's as far as I want to go in terms of that answer, again, because I'm not an expert in that field.
No, it's totally understandable. Uh, just one more final question. If you were to give advice to like fellow journalists about how they handle the coverage of school shootings, what would it be?
That's a really tough question because I think journalists do the best they can in reporting, and they don't just report the event, but then they report the subsequent reactions and the grief of family members. They report the what happened around response times and law enforcement. They report the legislative aspects of it. They report the political aspects of it. So there's it's not just one thing. And it's a maybe a funny bit of advice, not funny haha, but funny strange. I would say that one of the first things I would say is as a news director is on top of going out and doing your job and doing the job of telling the story of what happened and why it happened and how it happened and could it have been prevented and what is the what's next and who did it and who's grieving. I think it's also, maybe a piece of my advice would be in all of that tragedy and death and horror, it would be if I was sending a young journalist out from the newsroom to go cover a story, it would also be like, take care of yourself.
Mhm.
Don't be afraid to talk about the things that upset you. And that coming back to the newsroom and doing your job is important, but also that your colleagues should be offering up a supportive environment for you to talk about the things that you experienced. Because going back to doing that job, there is a little part of you that dies every time you have to go and knock on the door of a grieving relative and get them to trot out a photo of the person who died
Mhm.
and get them to talk about the person who died. There's a little part of you that dies every time. So it's not only about telling the story, but it's also about safeguarding yourself so that you can stay in the business long enough to tell the story again.
Thank you so much for answering my questions and providing some insight on the topic. I really appreciate you having you on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to my podcast surrounding this issue. If you're further interested in this topic, please look at my note to reader for a more in-depth look into this subject. Thank you and goodbye.